Good morning. It's a couple minutes after 10, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Creating Non-Employee Reimbursements in Concur webinar, hosted by the Office of University Controller in cooperation with the Procurement Service Center. My name is Michael Cusick. I'm the Multimedia and E-Learning Designer in the Office of the University Controller over at the System Office, and I have with me here today Christina Mendez, and I'll let her introduce herself right now.
Hi, I'm Christina. I'm the Finance and Procurement Learning Specialist with the Office of University Controller.
And she's going to be the one handling all of the presentation content today. So let me just get through a few housekeeping notes for everyone before we get started. In the Handouts tab, there is a copy of the latest edition of the PSC Communicator, which has a lot of the high-level information of what we're going to be talking about today, along with some really important links to more resources that we think are important for this content. So videos, how-to instructions, external websites that are going to be coming up on this. So feel free to download that. One other bit of kind of interactivity that we're going to incorporate today is just a couple of poll questions sprinkled throughout the content. So let's just give one a try now to sort of see how this works for everybody. So the poll question for this one is, in your department, what is the most common reason for reimbursing a non-employee? And the answers that we have are non-employee interviewing for a job, students purchasing project materials, individuals attending a conference or event, or another reason. And I do see all of your answers as they're submitted, and we'll give you all about 30 to 45 seconds to submit, and then we can kind of talk about the results. And in the meantime, Christina and I will just banter a little bit. So Christina, what do you see most of all when you are out training campuses in person?
Well, when I'm training and looking at the forms that were completed, I've seen a lot of departments reimbursing candidates for job interviews, and a lot of students buying course supplies for their projects.
All right, looks like 88% of you have voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now and share the results. And it looks like it's a little bit split between non-employees interviewing for a job and individuals attending a conference, so I think that makes a lot of sense based off what we were just talking about. So that's basically how those work. So thank you all for participating. We'll have a couple more. But in the meantime, let's get back to the content, and I'm going to turn it over to Christina now. So just take it away.
So thank you all for joining us today to talk about reimbursing non-employees. Today I'll be showing you how to create a non-employee reimbursement report in Concur. We'll identify key differences in how we treat certain expenses for a non-employee, and I'll show you how to look at payment status of the non-employee reimbursements that you enter in Concur. So let's talk a little about what non-employee reimbursements are. We create them to pay back our non-employees and our students whenever they spend their own money on university business. Some of the common examples we see are when we reimburse those candidates for job interviews, for their interview trips, when we reimburse students for course supplies, or when we reimburse non-employees or students for attendance at conferences. They're different from employee reimbursements in several ways, and we'll touch upon those as we walk through our example today. Until recently, these non-employee reimbursements were all completed on a form, the non-employee reimbursement form or the NR form. Now the non-employee reimbursement policy has been added into Concur. The paper form is not going away entirely, so it's important for us to understand when to use the paper form and when to use Concur. You'll use Concur when you need to reimburse a U.S. citizen that's living in the United States. For non-U.S. citizens or for U.S. citizens that are living abroad, you'll continue to use the paper form. You won't use Concur or the paper form whenever we're talking about reimbursing an independent contractor operating under a scope of work. Instead, those payments should be completed through the appropriate mechanism in the CU Marketplace. So the overall process for creating a non-employee expense report in Concur is the same as it is for employees. You'll create the report header, add expenses, attach documents, review the approval flow, and finally submit that expense report. The differences will lie in the detail of the report header and how you treat certain expenses. So let's walk through a non-employee expense report together. You'll begin the report on your Concur homepage by clicking New and Start a Report just as you'd begin any other expense report. And then on the header for policy, you'll select non-employee reimbursement as that policy. The report header will then update to show you some additional fields for information. We'll walk through some best practices for completing this report header. First, in the report name field, you want to enter a meaningful report name. This report name is going to be reflected on your financial statements, so you want it to be something that lets us know a little bit about the payment that's been completed. Here I've used the payee's last name as well as the purpose of their visit. Johnson came for an interview. Including the employee's last name as part of this report name alerts my approver that although I'm submitting the report from my Concur, it's actually paying someone else, our non-employee. Then you'll select the appropriate travel type, and if it's not travel related, you'll choose other non-travel. And you'll see the most common reasons why we reimburse a non-employee under the business purpose menu. This list is significantly smaller to what you might be used to seeing for employee reimbursements. If it's still unrelated to travel, you'll select other non-travel. Now's when we begin entering details about our payee. There's a single field name labeled payee name, and you'll use this field to enter the payee's full name, as it should appear on the check. So that's important. What you enter in this field will appear on the check. The typical format of this would be first name, space, last name, all in this field. And then you use the next series of fields to enter the check delivery address. This would typically be your non-employee's address. However, if you want it sent to your department, you'll enter your full department mailing address in these fields, not just the campus mailbox number. And you're only able to allow enter United States addresses in these fields. You'll mark this next box confirming that your payee is a U.S. citizen. If this box is not checked, you won't be able to proceed with saving the expense report. And if they're not a U.S. citizen, you'll proceed to complete the paper non-employee reimbursement form for that person. In the speed type field, you'll type and select the speed type just like on a travel reconciliation. And it'll be the default for all of the expenses on the report unless you allocate them later on at the line level. The Submits Report drop-down will be used to select how you want this expense report to be routed for approval, either to your HR supervisor or to someone with a fiscal role on the report speed type. If you select Speed Type Approver, you'll identify that person just before you submit the report. In the Comment field, you'll provide some general information about the reimbursement. For a trip, be sure to enter some trip dates into this field. The travel dates will help the approver review the report and match the per diem with the appropriate dates. And then finally, in this alternate contact employee field, if someone other than you should be the contact person for questions on the report, you would type and select their name here. And then click Next. Clicking Next saved your report. From this screen, you can start adding your expenses to the non-employee reimbursement report. And if you need to go back to make any changes to the report header that we were just on, for instance, you might need to update the address. You'll click on the report name, so in this instance, Johnson Interview, to return back to that header, make your changes, and then save it all over again.
And just to break in really quick here, while we're on this topic, we just had a good question come in. Does the person submitting this need to get the signature from their non-employee when you're using Concur?
When you're using Concur, the non-employee's signature is no longer needed. At the point that they submitted the receipts to you for reimbursement, that was their implicit certification that those were the correct expenses for it. However, if you're completing the paper form, you will still need that non-employee's signature.
Great, thank you.
So for a non-employee, you'll be adding all new expenses. You'll see in the right-hand panel of your Concur homepage, or not your homepage, from the expense report, that you'll see a full list of available expense types. There are going to be key differences to note in how you treat certain expenses for a non-employee, so we'll look at those. First up, and probably the most different, is meal per diem, the maximum allowable amount that we can reimburse someone for their travel meals. For a non-employee, you will not be using the itinerary feature in Concur as you're used to doing for an employee. Instead, you'll use the expense types that are listed under the travel meals section. And you'll see that we have 3 pairs of travel meals here. You'll see first and last day meals and daily meals for Boulder, Colorado Springs, then the same combination for Denver, Aurora, and finally that combination for other city rate for anywhere else. And per diem rates are set for every city are set by the federal government. The 2 Colorado expense types include the maximum dollar amount in the expense type names so that you don't have to look those up. However, if you're using the other city rate for anywhere else, you'll need to look up the per diem amounts for that specific destination. There's a link on the Procurement Service Center's website under Travel to look up meal per diem rates on that right-hand side of the page. That link is also available on today's handout, as well as in our how-to video that details adding meal per diem for non-employee reimbursement reports. And when you follow that link, it takes you to the GSA website, where you'll look up the meals and incidental breakdown for the non-employee's destination. The breakdown will show you the daily rate for per diem, as well as the rates for the first and last day of travel that are prorated to 75%. And these will be the maximum reimbursement rates for that location. In this example, a non-employee visits Denver for 4 days. I've used the first last day's expense type for Denver, Aurora to add meal per diem for the non-employee's travel days. And in those, the per diem's prorated to 75%. And then I use the daily meals type for Denver, Aurora to add per diem for any of the days in between on that 4-day trip. Now I have a line of per diem for each day of the trip. And if you compare the expense types to the amounts that are entered here, you'll notice that I'm reimbursing the full per diem rates. If you want to reimburse your non-employee for actual meal expenses up to the allowable rates, then you'll enter those actual expenses as the amounts. And as usual for per diem, you don't need to attach any receipts here.
So I just wanted to break real quick. We're getting a couple questions just about using per diem and the itinerary. So can you talk about why we're not using itineraries in this instance?
In this instance, we're not using itineraries because we're creating these expense reports within the employee's own Concur. So the itinerary feature can only be used once for a set of days, and we want to reserve those for the employee if there's any travel there. If a single employee is reimbursing several non-employees for their meal per diems, they wouldn't be able to use that itinerary feature. So for non-employees, we're using this separate expense type, the travel meals family, to do per diem. And we will continue using the itinerary feature for employees alone.
Okay. So itinerary is basically just employees only.
Yes.
For various reasons.
Yes.
All right, with that, we just went through a lot of stuff right there, so hopefully that wasn't too overwhelming. But we're going to take a break real quick and just get into one more poll question just to get everyone on their toes. So I'll launch that here for everybody. And so this is a bit of a word problem, so read it carefully. Our question is, if a CU student completes a 4-day trip to Chicago for a conference, and you need to provide their per diem, this is what are you going to do in Concur? So our 4 answers are, basically you would add 4 expenses as the meals other city rate, and then you would find Chicago's rate. Option number 2 is that you add 4 meals expenses other city rate and let the rate to default. Number 3 is you add just 1 expense for the meals other city rate, and then you just total all of the meals that they had in that 1 expense. Or you create an itinerary for Chicago, just like for an employee. Try to figure out which one of those you think is correct, and we will get back to you in a couple minutes once a lot of people have voted. So for me, as a layperson, this is not my wheelhouse. I'm going to go ahead and say that it's not creating an itinerary, because we just covered that. So for a non-employee, don't create an itinerary. And it sounded like, from your perspective, with an accounting background, that you want everything to have a nice, clean audit trail, so we don't combine all the expenses into 1 expense.
Nope, we keep those nice and separate.
Yep. And it looks like most of the audience is agreeing with that, which is, as most of you had said, adding 4 expenses and then entering Chicago's rate. So good job, everybody. And I think just like in the meantime, we have a couple questions building up, so I'm going to just kind of read through these and see if you would like to answer any of them.
Okay.
So someone's asking, how do we enter less than the max on daily meals?
You can enter less than the max on daily meals When you select that expense type and you're filling in the required fields on the right-hand side of the screen, for the amount fields, you'll just enter that lower amount there.
Right, because the field doesn't default to anything, so you have
doesn't.
to, whether or not you're using the max per diem or you're not using the max per diem, you have to enter that amount.
Exactly.
yourself.
That field comes up empty. So if you're using the max per diem for one of the Colorado areas where we include the meal per diem in the title, you'll look to the title and enter that amount, or you'll enter an amount lower than that.
And here's another question I think that is a good one. How do you handle it if like lunch is being provided, let's say, by the department?
Well, if lunch is being provided by the department, that would typically come out to be an official function.
Mm-hmm.
And then the department person who paid that would enter that on their travel reconciliation or their procurement card reconciliation if it was on the procurement card as an official function expense. And then when you look to reimburse the non-employee for their per diem, when you look at that GSA website, there's a breakdown of what each meal comes out to. You would simply reduce the amount that you're entering as per diem for that non-employee.
Right. So you enter the kind of the group function, the group lunch or whatever as a official function, which is its own thing.
Separate report.
And then you just sort of reduce their per diem for that day.
Exactly.
By that amount. Does that make sense?
So looking back to that example that we just covered, this is what that non-employee's 4-day trip to Chicago would look like. We've used the first last day meals for other city rate on the first and last days of the trip and used the prorated per diem that we found on the GSA website in the breakdown. And then for the days in between, we use daily meals, other city rate, with the full per diem that we found on the GSA website, or just like we were talking about, lower actual costs if that's what you want to reimburse.
And just to be clear, someone did ask, do you need to submit receipts for these?
No, you still do not need to submit receipts when we're talking about meal per diem. So that takes us through per diem. The next expense type that I wanted to discuss is mileage. You'll add mileage using the non-employee mileage expense type. You'll fill in all the required fields, and if you need to calculate the number of miles, you can use the mileage calculator. If you already know the number of miles, you can simply enter that in the distance field. Whether you fill in the distance directly or you use the mileage calculator, you don't need to deduct the commute when we're talking about a non-employee. So don't deduct the commute. Mileage was pretty simple. Now we're talking about lodging. You'll add these expenses using the non-employee lodging rates expense type. You'll complete the required fields. And then if the hotel bill has other charges on it like room service or parking, you'll deduct those from the total before you enter the adjusted amount in the amount field. For a non-employee, the difference is that you are not required to itemize the daily room rates and taxes. And if you deducted any of those non-lodging charges from the hotel bill, you'll enter those charges separately using the appropriate new expense types. And the room service is already covered in that meal per diem that we just discussed, so you wouldn't enter that separately.
So typically the charges that might be extra on a hotel bill are basically parking, internet, and room service.
Exactly.
And then you would just sort of deduct those from the total.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then you'll upload an itemized receipt for the lodging expense, as well as to any other expenses that are over $75 or any official functions in any amount. That takes us through all the big changes to expenses. Before you submit, you're encouraged to print and review the report. So you would do this by using the print menu to select CU detailed report, and you'd be able to see a detailed review of that report that you just created. And then you would submit the report for the non-employee. When you click submit, you'll have an opportunity to review the approval flow window and insert any approvers if you want to. Here, this one's going first to my manager because I've selected HR supervisor back on that report header that we discussed earlier. Had I selected speed type approval, I would use this field to enter the asterisk, which would populate a list of available approvers for that speed type, and I would select an approver from that list. And finally, I would click submit report. Now we'll go over how to look up payment status for any of these non-employee reimbursements that you created and processed in Concur.
Actually, before we get there, there's a couple of questions coming up that I just want to get to before we move on completely from Concur. So what happens if an employee quits and then comes back and says that they are owed mileage? Do we still deduct a commute as if they were an employee, or do we not deduct the commute as if they were a non-employee?
If the mileage was completed during the time that they were acting as an employee, I would proceed to deduct the commute.
Okay. Do study subject stipends and travel use count in this process for students?
As long as they're not related to any independent contractor, statement of works, yes, you can reimburse in this manner if they meet the eligible standards.
Okay.
U.S. citizen living in the U.S.
And then additionally, what happens when spouses come along for an interview, let's say?
I would want to confirm a little bit more on the spouses, since typically a lot of the times when we're reimbursing spouses, it's more considered part of a house hunting trip, which is separate. I would want to look up more on that before I respond.
Okay. And just so for everyone out there listening, there's a lot of kind of situational questions coming in, like very specific things. Feel free to reach out to us after this webinar. The FinPro Help Desk is always available to answer any questions for kind of those individual cases. So we're trying not to get too bogged down in the weeds on those.
And I'll be taking down your names and such so that I can follow up on those appropriately.
Yes, but thank you for asking. It's good to know how complex these can sometimes become.
They really can. So now for looking at payment status, we have two ways that we can do it. Here it depends on who created the report. If you created the expense report, you'll be able to see simple payment status right in Concur. If that's the case, go up to the Expense tab and select Report Library. And this will default to showing you reports for the last 90 days. If the non-employee reimbursement was older than 90 days, you can use that View menu on the left-hand screen to expand your search. When you do locate that non-employee reimbursement, you'll be looking at the payment status column to see if it has a status of paid. When it's marked paid, a warrant is usually produced within a day or two. Now, if you want more detailed information about that payment, aside from whether it was simply paid, or let's say you were not the one who created the report, you'll need to look it up in the finance system instead of Concur. And we have a how-to video that shows you how to look up these non-employee reimbursement payments with procedures under it. So here I've logged into the finance system and I've navigated to the voucher inquiry page. And since this navigation is a bit deep, it's helpful to save that to your favorites menu, especially if you're looking up a lot of non-employee reimbursements. And then you'd be on the voucher inquiry page. Before entering any information, it's important to scroll all the way down to the voucher style box and select single payment voucher before anything else. And then you would scroll back up to find the supplier name field and enter the name of the non-employee as it was entered on the report header. So if someone else created this, it's important to communicate how that full name was entered. And when it displays below that box, you'll select it. Then you'll scroll down back to the search bar, click search, and you'll see voucher inquiry results in a separate box on the bottom of the page. The actions menu on the left of that box is what you'll click to select payment information. And now is where you can see much more about that payment. You'll see a payment reference ID, which is a check number. You'll see a payment date and a payment amount. And if you click on that value that's under payment reference ID, you can find out whether or not the check was cashed. When you look at this check here under reconciliation status, you'll see a status of either unreconciled or reconciled. Reconciled means the check has in fact been cashed.
So let's bring up poll question number 3 now, which is kind of just an overview of what we just talked about. So when you are looking up reimbursement payments, what information can you see in Fin? And so this is a little bit different than what you could see in Concur, which has just basically it's either paid or unpaid, correct?
Exactly.
All right, so what we're looking for is, can we see the check number, payment date, payment amount, reconciliation status, or all of the above? This is a little bit of an easier question for everybody. I'm just going to go through some of the questions that we have to see if you can answer them, just kind of while everyone's still having a chance to vote. Here's one. So on the paper form, this person is saying that they would fill it out, have the non-employee sign, and then they would sign. If you create the expense report for a non-employee, can they also sign as a fiscal manager? So like basically if they're the person who's the manager and they also create the report, is that okay?
If you are the fiscal manager on the speed type, I would say yes.
Yeah. I think that probably, I'm sure, happens quite often.
Yeah.
So thank you for that question. And then this is a term that I'm not really familiar with. What about honorariums? Are those treated any differently than non-employees or students?
Yes. It's okay as long as you're not paying an independent contractor with contracted services where you need to keep all those reimbursements associated with the SOW. It's okay to pay an honorarium on a payment voucher, but also to reimburse their expenses through the non-employee reimbursement policy.
Great. Thank you for that. If you look at the results of the poll, all of you almost answered all of the above, which is true.
Great.
All of that information can be found in the Fin system, so that is the advantage of looking at the payment status in Fin versus just in Concur. So if you needed a little bit more granular detail, that's where you want to go.
All right. So the last bit of our content is resources for everyone. We went through a lot of information today, so I want to be able to show you where you can find more information for when you're in the system processing these non-employee reimbursement reports. If you go to the Procurement Service Center's website and click on the Training tab, you'll see an area for reconciling non-employee travel. This page will explain when to use Concur and when to use the form. It also has a related links box that highlights several short videos and procedures. So you'll see one video that shows you how to create a non-employee reimbursement, and it shows the conditions for reimbursing non-employees through Concur. This walks through a sample non-employee reimbursement from start to finish. Then the next really helpful video is adding meal per diems to non-employee reimbursement reports. This details how to use those travel meals expense types together to add per diem to a non-employee reimbursement report, and it discusses using the appropriate pair of those expense types to add a line of per diem for every day of the trip. Under this video, you'll also see another link to that GSA website where you can look up per diem rates for any of the non-Colorado sites where we have expense types for them. And then finally, you'll find another video on looking up non-employee reimbursement payments. And this is tailored for the non-employee reimbursement reports that we're completing in Concur. So it shows you what I just showed you, where a report creator can find simple payment status in Concur, and then it shows how to find more detailed information in the finance system. I'd also like to point out that in the right-hand side box that you're seeing on this screen is a related links sidebar that has another video called Looking Up Payments in the Finance System. That video is going to demonstrate how to look up any payments for non-employee reimbursements that were completed on the NR form.
All right, and that brings us kind of to the end, so we're going to just leave some time for questions. We have maybe 10 or 15 minutes or so, just depending on how many people we get. So I think this is an easy one for you to answer. When does this go into effect, and will NR forms for U.S. citizens still be allowed, or must people go through Concur?
I can definitely answer that. This went into effect on August 1st, so we've had this policy in Concur for about a week now. For the time being, the payables team in the Procurement Service Center will be doing parallel processing. So you'll have the option to use either the NR form or Concur to reimburse those U.S. citizens that are living in the U.S. After that point, which has not yet been determined, we'll communicate that to all of you once we know the date. You'll be able to only use Concur for those eligible expenses, or those eligible reimbursements to U.S. citizens living in the United States, and then you'll proceed to continue using the paper form for any international payments, so our non-U.S. citizens and any of our U.S. citizens that are living abroad.
Someone's asking if by entering a non-employee address, will it create a vendor in the system?
It's not going to create a vendor in the system. If these are coming through as a very special kind of payment called a single payment voucher, those are special one-time payments. That's why we're going through a separate screen in Fin to find the payment status of these customized payments.
So not a vendor.
No.
Someone's asking, do student employees have access to Concur even? Yes, we've just been confirmed by our superiors that yes, students do have access to Concur. So if you do have student workers and you want them to be creating these reports on your behalf for other non-employees, that is perfectly okay. And then someone's asking, are receipts required for any purchase over $75 as a general rule?
Yes. That is our general rule for our travel reconciliation policy in Concur, as well as this non-employee reimbursement policy. They're also required for any official functions and any amount.
Gotcha. Someone's asking, they always get confused if you should use HR approver or speed type approver. So do you have a suggestion for when they would use one or the other?
One of the most common ones I see here, and what I do myself in most scenarios, is to use my HR approver. It'll go to my HR approver per HCM. It is appropriate to use the speed type approver often, but if you use the speed type approver, what you'll want to do is select that asterisk on the final field, the approval flow window, to make sure that you're selecting someone who should be approving those expenses.
And maybe the supervisor wasn't really involved in this particular thing, so there might be a more appropriate person. Does this mean that reports submitted this way will generate a check and not direct deposit?
That is correct.
Okay, so it always will be a check. So the NR form apparently required a student ID if we were reimbursing a student. Is this no longer necessary?
If you're reimbursing a student through Concur travel and expense, so if they're a U.S. citizen in the United States, then no, you're not going to need that student ID there.
Yeah, it seems like there's quite a lot of implied approval when you're using Concur versus the old system.
But if you're still using the non-employee reimbursement form for any of these students, then I would say continue filling out those required fields. So if it's the non-employee reimbursement form asking for the student ID, fill it in there.
Cool.
I'll reiterate that there are no changes to how we're completing the non-employee reimbursement form. Anything that you were previously doing to make sure that form was complete, you do so. It's only in those instances where we have U.S. citizens that are in the U.S. that we're doing through Concur, where you have a little difference in how they're being completed.
Someone's asking if they can reimburse a student if they're also an employee. So if someone has double status, what situation would you use for that?
Well, you'll want to consider in what capacity you're reimbursing them. If it was in their capacity as a student and not as an employee, then you would do so using the appropriate mechanism, either the NR form or Concur. If it was in their capacity as an employee, you would use Concur and select travel reconciliation as you would do for the policy, as you would do for any other employee.
Well, I think that's all that we have coming in for so far. We can end a couple minutes early today. Hopefully that's good news for everybody. Thank you very much all for joining us today. Thank you, Christina, for putting all this presentation together. And like I said, we will be posting this webinar as a recording on the procurement website. And please reach out to the LUC Help Desk or
FinPro Help.
FinPro Help Desk. If you have any other questions, they are the experts in all things related to these systems, and so they can answer your specific questions. And I will be sending out the PDF deck to those of you who asked for it, so be on the lookout for that. Awesome. So again, thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.